It was New Year's Eve in Pensacola, Florida, and the city buzzed with excitement as it welcomed 1985. At Daryl's Bar and Grill, Tanya McKinley, a 23-year-old mother, was enjoying the festivities with friends. She was a devoted mother to her 18-month-old and was known for her lively spirit and infectious laughter. After the midnight countdown, the celebrations continued, but Tanya said goodbye to her friends at around 1:30 a.m. and left the bar alone. Her body was discovered 4 hours later, 7 miles away from the bar in an empty parking lot. Her half-clothed body was found by a couple taking their dog to an emergency vet clinic. The police investigation began quickly, and initially, detectives had high hopes in finding her killer. Tanya had been strangled and sexually assaulted. They interviewed her friends and family, thinking her killer was from her circle. As far as evidence collected, police had a substantial amount of DNA. They had hair from the head and pubic area and semen. Despite best efforts of detectives, a suspect was never found, and the case went cold. The case was never forgotten, though. It was revisited every few years, and as detectives retired, it was passed on to the next generation of detectives. With every advance in technology, Tanya's case would be looked over. Eventually, this became Pensacola's oldest cold case. Detectives were determined to give her family and her son closure in her senseless murder. When the Pensacola Police Department heard about other states' success with old DNA evidence being used to reverse engineer family trees, they immediately reached out to Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon was able to identify distant cousins, and from there they started piecing a family tree together. After 35 years, they finally had a suspect, Daniel Leonard Wells. A 57-year-old man still living in Pensacola area was under surveillance for several months before his arrest. Police needed him to discard something with DNA evidence, and eventually police witnessed him discarding a cigarette, but Wells did have a criminal record. He was arrested in '87 for battery and witness tampering, but the witness tampering charge was dropped, and he pleaded no contest in the battery charge. He was arrested in '88 for solicitation of a prostitute, but it appears that he was never formally charged. He was arrested and held without bond, where he had faced charges of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual battery. While in custody, he hung himself in his jail cell days before his first court appearance. He never had to face Tanya's family. Her son, who is now 37 years old with a family of his own. Tanya's family is disappointed that they never got the justice they had hoped for, but they said still knowing who would kill Tanya would help finally put her to rest. On January 16, 1980, Helen Krenitsky, a 21-year-old Wheaton College student, got off the bus at her Englewood stop. She was 2 weeks into her new internship with the news department at the KHHOW radio station. She was a dedicated student, one of the first students to be accepted into this particular internship. From her stop, it was only a 6-block walk to her aunt and uncle's house, but Helen never made it there. She disappeared somewhere between the bus stop she got off at and home. She normally left the radio station at around 6 using the same routine, the same bus schedule since she had moved there. When she didn't arrive home at her usual time, her aunt and uncle called the police, however. A young woman not arriving home for supper on time was a low priority on police radar. The body man near the field where she had been dumped. She agreed to go under hypnosis and give the police sketch artist enough details to create a composite image in Helen's case. There was DNA evidence available, a sketch of a person of interest, and police thought for sure someone had witnessed Helen being abducted from the bus stop, but no further witnesses came forward and no other evidence proved to propel the case forward. It was also an attack that seemed to be one in a series of crimes in the area that seemed to be escalating to Helen's murder. But her case, like many others, became a box that was filed in the back of the storage room to waiting for a lead, waiting for a witness, waiting for advances in technology. Helen would wait for justice for 39 years. With the successful capture of several prolific serial killers and rapists using reverse genealogy, detectives felt Helen Krenitsky's cult case would be an excellent case to try the technology. They uploaded the DNA sample to JetMatch and got a few familial matches. Getting to their suspect posed a greater challenge due to a convoluted family tree. Detectives took 2 years narrowing down potential matches. A maternal match was a woman who had used 6 last names in her lifetime, had 5 children with 2 different men, and most of her children were in the care of others, all with name changes. One son, who was most closely matched to their suspect in age, lived in the area at the time of the murder. Curtis Allen White lived with his father as an infant, but was raised by an aunt and uncle until his teens. He was a frequent runaway and was in and out of foster care. He also had a brother with a lengthy criminal history, and detectives worked to obtain genetic material from both men. His brother was eliminated. Krenitsky's murderer James Curtis Clanton lived in Denver in 1980, where he was actually on parole for a violent assault in Arkansas in 1975. He pleaded guilty to entering a woman's home, forcing her into her bedroom at knife point. He'd been sentenced to 30 years, but had only served 4 before making parole. He was released in 1979, long before CODIS was established, before there were sex offender registrations, before publications of violent offenders being released back into the community was a thing. Violent offenders being released back into the community was a thing. He married for the first time in 1980. His first wife left him after 30 days. In 1982, he changed his name, moved to Florida, had another short marriage. He was arrested on domestic violence charges in 1998. Clanton had never been a suspect until his genetic profile came under purview of detectives. Decades later, detectives were able to locate him in the Lake Butler area of Florida. They spent a week following him, waiting for him to leave behind an object containing his DNA. Finally, on November 30th, Clanton left a beer bug behind in a bar, and police were able to take it and get a DNA sample. They tested the beer bug's DNA to the original genetic profile from Pelane's body, and they were able to get a direct match. Clanton was arrested while exiting his truck and charged with first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping. He was then extradited from Florida to Colorado. 40 years after Helen was murdered and left naked in a field, her murderer would face justice. He could not be charged in her rape due to the statute of limitations being expired. He pleaded guilty. He hasn't been sentenced yet, but he faces 20 years. He can apply for parole in 2040, and he will be 82 then. Helen's older sister Janet Johnson thanked detectives, saying, "The detectives and everyone else who helped make this happen, you are my heroes." Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. It was September 20th, 1982 when 8-year-old Kellyn Rehr said goodbye to her teacher and classmates and began the 15-block trek home. She walked the same route every day. It was a busy road with local businesses and lots of people around, an unlikely place for a child to be in danger, or so it was thought. People witnessed seeing her walking down the busy East 16th Street. But when she was crossing an intersection, she simply disappeared. When Kellyn failed to return home at her normal time, her mother wasn't immediately concerned. She thought that Kellyn went to a friend's house or stayed at school late. After a few hours, however, she began calling around, first to the school and then friends. By 6 p.m., however, her mother called 911 to report her daughter missing. Police immediately began an investigation and a massive search was undertaken. It became clear that she was abducted. Her body discovered 2 days later, dumped in a cornfield. She had been beaten, assaulted, and strangled to death. DNA from the scene was collected and preserved. Leads quickly ran out, evidence led to dead ends, and the case went cold. Kellyn's family was left without answers for nearly 4 decades before being informed of a break in the case. Columbus investigators had begun working with a reverse engineering company called Advanced DNA to identify suspects in cold cases. Upon reopening up Kellyn's case, they discovered distant relatives of a suspect. They tracked the DNA back to a man named Harold Warren Jarrell, a now deceased man. He had never been a suspect in the case, even though he'd only been out of jail for less than a year for her made a different 8-year-old girl in the same area. This case is frustrating given that Jarrell passed in 1996. He was only 67. Kellyn's life was cut so short. Her family said in a statement to the media that they don't feel a sense of justice was served because justice is only a consolation prize. However, they are grateful the killer is deceased as it spares them the torment of a painful trial. A security guard is conducting his routine patrol at the Truck Stops America stop on North 1st Avenue, just off Interstate 24. Given the high traffic and proximity to a high-crime area in Nashville, security is tight with regular patrols and a network of CCTV cameras monitoring the site. As he goes about his duties, he stumbles upon a distressing scene. A woman's body is discovered. She has been shot dead and posed on her back, with her feet together and legs apart, with her arms above her head. He quickly calls emergency services. Little did the police know, this would put them in a race against time to find a sadistic serial killer before he struck again. 25-year-old Sarah Hulbert had had a difficult life. After losing her mother at a young age, she was sent to live with relatives out of state. She would later move back to Tennessee to be closer to her siblings. After falling in love, she would go on to have 2 daughters who were the center of her world. The happiness was not to last, however. She would soon spiral into a drug addiction after her relationship had fallen apart, and she had become a single mother as a result. She had tried to beat her crack cocaine addiction for the sake of her 2 young children. As she continued to fall deeper into drug addiction, her daughters were removed from her care. In bids to get clean, she would be in and out of rehab several times. But without her children, she spiraled further into the destructive addiction that had taken so much from her. She had become a sex worker to buy drugs and would often visit truck stops to make money. Detective Sergeant Pat Postiglione arrived on scene at the truck stop. One thing that immediately stood out to him was the lack of blood at the scene. This indicated the victim had been killed elsewhere, and then her body had been moved to that location and posed in the lewd position. Due to the positioning of the body and lack of evidence from the scene of the crime, it was the worst fears of officers that this was not a first-time killing. This was someone who had killed before. The task that lay before the officers was huge. This was an incredibly busy truck stop with truckers and people coming and going all the time. But one thing they knew was that her body had been dumped there within the previous 30 minutes. The security guard who had made the discovery said she wasn't there when he last checked, half an hour ago. As officers found out and began conducting a search of the scene, near the body, they found a footprint with an unusual sole that was often seen in work boots. It was vital for the officers to check the CCTV, and it was this that would give them a major lead. A yellow truck is seen coming in and driving all the way to the back of the truck stop where the body of the woman had been discovered by the security guard. 16 minutes later, the truck is seen coming back out. Checks from the stop revealed no evidence to show that the truck had stopped to refill or buy food. As the investigations of the crime scene continued, a post-mortem was carried out on the victim. Her body was found to have bruises and cuts, indicating a struggle had taken place. Her body also showed signs of torture. Her rear had a significant injury, suggesting part of her skin had been cut out with a knife. Semen found inside her body was sent off to have the DNA analyzed. It was revealed that she had died from a single close-range gunshot wound from a .22 caliber gun. Running her fingerprints through the database, it came back with a match, and they could finally put a name to their victim. She was 25-year-old Sarah Hulbert. Her family were immediately contacted. They went straight to the coroner's office in disbelief, hoping that maybe it wasn't her. A few months prior to her death, she had made the decision to finally overcome her demons and was in recovery after another rehab stint. But sadly, she would later relapse and begin using again. Near to where her body had been discovered, there was a hole in the fence where drug dealers and sex workers would enter and exit the truck stop to avoid being seen by the security guards. Her sisters mentioned to the police that she had 2 known male associates who were also in the drug scene, and police believed they were with her the night she had been murdered. The men were soon tracked down and questioned. As they were involved in the drug scene, they were reluctant to talk to the investigators. However, when the seriousness of the situation they found themselves in began to dawn on them, they admitted to being her pimps. They were adamant. They had absolutely nothing to do with her murder. They'd been driving around with Sarah at about 10 p.m. on June 26th, and an argument had broken out. They said she exited the vehicle and went into the truck stop. Sarah Hulbert never returned. After waiting a few hours and she still hadn't come back, they assumed she must have left with the trucker, and so they too decided to leave. They agreed to give DNA samples to clear their names. When the results came in, the semen sample taken earlier did not match either of their DNA. They were ruled out as suspects. The DNA sample did not match with any sample from the sex offender database. The police then turned to the FBI for help to see if they had any cases on their nationwide database that matched the modus operandi of this one that had been committed in a different jurisdiction. And this would lead to the news that could blow the case wide open. There had been a previous murder of a woman in Lebanon, Tennessee on June 6, 2007. Just off of Interstate 40, the naked body of a woman was found in a garbage bin in a Pilot Station truck stop on Murfreesboro Road. She was later identified as 48-year-old Samantha Winters. She was a sex worker and had worked at the same truck stop where Sarah had been found. Police believed that she had been picked up at the Nashville truck stop, murdered, and then her body taken out to Lebanon. Her body had been posed and she had been killed by a .22 caliber gun. But the horrifying information did not stop there. The database had 2 more matches in different states, with these murders taking place before Sarah Hulbert had been killed. One of these victims had been a woman called Sherry Drinkard, who was 43 years old. Her naked body had been dumped and then posed, just like the other victims, in Lake Station, Indiana by the side of the road. And she too had died from a gunshot wound to the head fired from a .22 caliber weapon. The other victim was found in a motel car park in Georgia on January 29, 2007 at 5 p.m. Like the other victims, she had died from a gunshot wound from a .22 caliber gun. They ran the fingerprints through the database to try and work out who she was. It was revealed that she was a mother of 5 from Atlanta, Deborah and Glover. She had spoken to her eldest child just a few hours before her death and asked her to tell her siblings that she had always and would always love them. She also told her not to call the number back. When she still hadn't contacted them, her daughter became increasingly concerned for her welfare. Deborah had been battling a drug addiction and working as a sex worker. In November 2006, her daughter tried to help her beat her addiction. And in December, she had began to make big steps on the road to recovery. But she would soon disappear. Although Deborah had not been found in a truck stop, it was an area that was regularly used by truckers. The police now had 4 female victims spanning across different states. All sex workers, all posed in a degrading position, all dead from a .22 caliber gun. Detective Sergeant Pat Postiglione knew it was vital to revisit the Nashville truck stop to make sure that absolutely no stone had been left unturned. As he was driving, he saw a truck headed towards him, bearing a striking resemblance to the one seen on the CCTV footage taken from the night Sarah Hulbert had been murdered. Postiglione turned around and followed the truck after calling his colleagues to tell them what he had seen and give them a description of the vehicle. He approached the truck after it had pulled into the truck stop but got no response after banging on the door. After banging for a second time, a man pulled the window curtain back and looked down at him. Postiglione explained that he was with the police, and following this, the driver opened the door and exited the truck. Postiglione would later say the driver appeared as if he had just been woken up. He was asked to present his driver's license and identify himself. And finally, they had a name, Bruce Douglas Mendenhal. Postiglione engaged him in conversation, asking how long he had worked as a trucker and when the truck had last been in the area. Mendenhal said that the truck was last in Nashville in May. As the pair were talking, Postiglione spotted something. There was blood on Mendenhal's left arm and on the inside of the driver's side door. So as not to arouse suspicion, Postiglione told Mendenhal that officers were asking drivers of this kind of truck to provide DNA samples. Mendenhal signed the consent form and provided a mouth swab then and there. Postiglione asked him if he could look inside the truck. Mendenhal agreed. Behind the seats was a sleeping compartment where Postiglione found a pair of work boots. The sole bore a striking resemblance to the unusual footprints that had been found by Sarah's body. Behind the driver's seat was a black trash bag containing clothes, shoes, and tissues, all soaked in blood. Mendenhal explained that when he had been trying to enter the truck a few hours prior, he had accidentally cut his leg, and that was where the blood had come from. He was asked to show the cuts, but there was none. Mendenhal's story suddenly changed. He said the blood actually belonged to a sex worker he had picked up the night before and she had cut her hand. Postiglione knew it was vital to ensure that Mendenhal did not have access to any weapons. Mendenhal explained that he did have a gun in the truck and handed it over to Postiglione. It was a .22 caliber rifle. Postiglione knew the game was up and bluntly asked him if this was the truck the police had been looking for. He asked several times before Mendenhal shrugged his shoulders and said, "If you say it is." Postiglione asked him if he was the person they had been searching for. Mendenhal gave the same response. He shrugged his shoulders and replied, "If you say so." By this point, Postiglione's partner had arrived on scene, and after he was escorted out of the truck, Bruce Mendenhal was arrested. It was vital to secure the truck and preserve any evidence, so it was sent to a crime lab to be processed. Over 300 items from his truck were cataloged as evidence, including handcuffs, knives, tape, and sex toys. Blood spatter was found on the walls, mattress, floor, and ceiling. The news that came next was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. It emerged that the blood belonged to 7 different women. The bloody clothing found in the bag belonged to a sex worker from Indiana. Her family had not yet realized she had gone missing. The bullet that had killed Sarah Holbert had been fired from the gun found in his truck, and the blood on the gun came back to her and at least one other woman. Mendenhal signed a rights waiver and said he would voluntarily give them a statement without the presence of a lawyer. But who exactly was Bruce Mendenhal? He had been born on April 14, 1951 in Crawford, Illinois. As an adult, he had lived on Pine Street close to downtown Albion. A neighbor from Pine Street would later say that visitors wouldn't often come to the Mendenhal household, adding, "He was a little different." In 1997, he had ran in the mayoral elections, but incumbent Reverend Bill Rucker had won in a landslide. Mendenhal had come in last place. When looking into Mendenhal's background, the police discovered a man with no record of violence, and he had not had any run-ins with the law. On the face of it, he appeared to be a typical family man, married with 2 grown-up daughters. Jimmy Nesbitt reported for the Courier-Press that Mendenhal had later moved into a small home in the country surrounded by farms. This house would later be searched by police to try and help build a picture of who he was and add to their evidence. One of his neighbors recalled that Mendenhal and his wife had shown upon her driveway, his wife asking her if she wanted to purchase anything from a catalog. Mendenhal stayed in the vehicle. The neighbor said he just sat in the car and had a weird look on his face. The report in the Courier-Press also said he would often ignore his neighbors if they tried to interact with him. The mayor of Albion, Ryan Hallam, would say he hadn't really had any run-ins with the law. Everybody thought he was a little mouthy and so forth like that. Anything off kilter? No, not too much. The minister from the church close to the Mendenhal's home said that after he was arrested, his family was struggling to come to terms with the news. The news of his arrest was the talk of the town. Mayor Hallam said, "We've got 2,000 people. The news spreads like wildfire. People in Albion could not believe that one of their own was capable of such horrific crimes. Everyone's in disbelief that we had an individual living here like this. He didn't mix well with others around him, but we never had any problems with him," said Mayor Hallam. It was now time for the police to interview their suspect. But before they knew it, he made a shocking admission. He said that he had dumped the bodies, but he hadn't killed any of them. He explained that 2 men, Richie and David, were the real murderers they were looking for. He said they would go to every truck stop he went to, and by the time they left, there would be a dead body in his truck. He would later say that a 3rd person named Terry was also involved. He said they would leave him to clean up. He told the officers they would always use his gun to kill the women and then leave their bodies in his vehicle. When talking about Sarah Hulbert, he said that he had gone into the truck stop, and when he came out, he found her dead body in his truck. He said that, in a moment of panic, he took her body out of the truck and left her on the ground in the far corner of the stop. He told Postiglione, "I'm pissed off at Richie and David because they did all the killings." Officers did look into his claims and found that the 3 men in question did actually exist. They were all interviewed, and their fingerprints and DNA samples were taken. It turned out he had had altercations with all of these men over minor things. He then offered up another shocking confession. The latest murder had actually taken place the day before in Indiana. They then presented him with the evidence that they had gathered from the truck. Despite his claims, there was only one set of prints on the gun, Bruce Mendenhal's. There was also no evidence to prove that any of those men had been in the back of the truck. When Mendenhal was asked if he was the killer, he refused to talk anymore and requested a lawyer. The police, assisted by the FBI, worked in collaboration with investigators from the other jurisdictions where the murders had occurred. Using fuel receipts, they constructed a timeline of his movements and were able to place him in the locations the victims' bodies had been found. But what could the motive possibly have been? Postiglione would later say in a documentary he thought that it was potentially his hatred of sex workers that would be at the truck stops and his desire to degrade them post-mortem with the lewd posing of their bodies. Mendenhal's daughter disagreed and would say, "He never had a negative thing to say about anyone who chose that lifestyle. There's people like that will do that. Everybody knows that. Dad, he didn't really pay attention to it." He was charged with criminal homicide and taken to the Metro Davidson County Jail, where he was held without bond. Following this, it was time for Bruce Mendenhal to go on trial for the murder of Sarah Hulbert. His attorney, Jason Gickner, said that he had entered a plea of not guilty by video arraignment. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the plethora of physical evidence that had been gathered. Prosecutors were not seeking the death penalty, as there were no aggravating circumstances that are required in the state of Tennessee. They also ensured that the jury were reminded of Sarah and who she was. They wanted to emphasize that she was a real person with children and a family who cared deeply for her. She was not just another piece of the evidence. After closing arguments, the jury retired to consider the evidence, and before long they had reached their verdict. Bruce Mendenhal was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Sarah Hulbert. In Tennessee, a first-degree murder conviction and subsequent life sentence is interpreted to mean 60 years in prison. A shocking story would soon be reported. Whilst in prison, his wife had passed away from natural causes. Following her death, Mendenhal received the insurance money. He used this money to offer $15,000 to 2 inmates to kill the 3 men he had tried to blame for the murders. One of the murders was due to be staged as a copycat to mislead the police into thinking the real murderer was still out there. But it didn't stop there. He had allegedly tried to have 2 investigators, Pat Postiglione and Lee Freeman, murdered. Postiglione would later remark that in his career spanning more than 3 decades, he had never known of someone trying to have him murdered. He said, "When you are putting people away in prison, potentially for the rest of their lives, I guess you could possibly become a target for those reasons, so we take it very serious." In 2010, he went on trial for these offenses. The court heard from the 2 inmates he had tried to pay to commit the murders. One of them was imprisoned for explosives charges and was asked by prosecutor Rachel Sobrero, "What were his words to the best of your recollection?" He replied, "How much C4 would it take to blow up a trailer?" They also heard from the other inmates who were serving 10 years on burglary charges. He was belligerent about those 2 officers. He wanted those 2 officers dead. That's point blank what he said. At around 2:30 p.m., the jury retired to deliberate, and less than 4 hours later, they had reached a verdict. He was found not guilty of the allegations relating to wanting to have the 2 officers killed. When it came to the plot to have the 3 other men killed, he was convicted. Davidson County Criminal Court Judge Steve Dozier sentenced him to 30 years in prison, 10 years for each count that would be served consecutively. He was also charged with the murder of Samantha Winters. On the August 2, 2007, Mendenhal waived his right to a preliminary hearing, and a few weeks later, on 17th, Bruce Mendenhal was indicted by a Wilson County grand jury for the murder of Samantha Winters. Prior to standing trial in this case, Mendenhal filed an appeal against his conviction for the murder of Sarah Hulbert. He argued that his legal counsel had been ineffective. He said there were 7 possible suspects and that his lawyers could have shown evidence to demonstrate this. However, it was noted that he had failed to give said list to the court. His appeal also said he wanted further DNA testing to be carried out. The Tennessee Criminal Court of Appeals rejected this. Since his appeal had been rejected, the trial for Samantha's case could now go forward. His lawyer said, "If you look at the crime in Lebanon and at the truck stop murders, it's really not the sign of a serial killer. They got a lot of blood evidence. They've got pages of blood evidence. But none of it is from Samantha Winters. It's from Sarah Hulbert. But the prosecution fired back saying, "I don't care what kind of person Samantha Winters was, what kind of life she led. She didn't deserve this." When all the evidence had been presented, the jury would deliberate for less than 2 hours before they returned a verdict of guilty for abuse of a corpse and first-degree murder. He again was sentenced to life in prison. In 2008, it was reported he had been linked to yet another killing. 28-year-old Letitia Yvonne Milliken had gone missing from Nashville. She was living in a makeshift camp off of Hermitage Avenue amongst other homeless people. She had also been a sex worker. Post Leone had worked with her family to try and find her. Her family hadn't heard from her for the last couple of months. And on the June 26, 2007, a missing persons report was filed, the same day Sarah Hulbert's body had been found. The police had been given an item that contained Letitia's DNA to compare with some of the blood found in Mendenhal's truck. Came back as a match. Karma Pupura was a 32-year-old mother to 2 children and was known to visit truck stops regularly. She had last been seen in the south side of Indianapolis, Interstate 465, at a Flying J truck stop. Sergeant Matt Mount of the MPD said, "They've taken DNA from both parents to try and match with the DNA from the blood on the clothing that was found inside the truck down in Tennessee. The DNA tests came back as a match." The police also found the clothes she had been wearing that day, her phone, and her bank card. On April 10, 2008, Mendenhal was charged with the murder of Karma Pupura, even though her body hadn't been found. Helen Marshall, the deputy prosecutor for Marion County, said, "It definitely makes it much more difficult to proceed. We are working very hard to be able to file the case against him here." August 15, 2011. At the 8-mile marker of the Lewis B. Nunn Parkway in Kentucky, human remains were found. The medical examiner's office used DNA to identify the person. It came back as being the remains of Karma Pupura. In Birmingham, Alabama, Mendenhal was charged with the murder of Lucille Carter, known as Gretna. She had been found in a bin. A bag was covering her head and face, and there was tape wrapped around her neck. She had also been left naked, and like the other women, she had died from a bullet fired from a .22 caliber gun. Indianapolis Deputy Police Chief Scott Robinette said, "It would not be too far of a stretch to say there's probably women who are missing and may have been subject to his hands. Yet we have not found those victims. The brutal and depraved crimes of Bruce Mendenhal have left families and communities in tatters. His crimes are impossible to comprehend with no motive, and the full extent of them may never be fully known. Many are holding on to the hope that they will one day have the answers they desperately need and that their loved ones will see justice be served." Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Michaela Bali was 16 when she went missing. Known for her shy and introverted nature, Michaela appeared troubled the night before her disappearance. She had asked a friend for a ride to the bank the next morning and expressed her frustration about a boy to another friend. She seemed to be a very lonely teenager. Although she had friends she went to school with, none of them seemed to really know what she did outside of school. Her friends knew she talked to people online but didn't know any details about who she was talking to or if she was meeting people in person that she met online. Her mother said nothing was out of the ordinary that morning. They both got up, got ready for work together, and she was dropped off at the Sacred Heart High School by her grandmother around 8 a.m. Michaela checked into the school's Wi-Fi at 8 o'clock and 8 seconds a.m. She was seen by the school's surveillance system to have left the property by 8:26 a.m. after putting her school things from her bag into her locker. Her ex-boyfriend sent her a text message asking her why she wasn't in her first class, and Michaela said was on the other side of town. Upon leaving school, she walked to the nearest TD Bank. She arrived before it had opened, and she is seen waiting at the front. When it opened, she withdrew $55 from her account and headed to a pawn shop to try and sell a silver ring. The pawn shop owner recalled Michaela and said the ring had very little value and he didn't buy it from her. He also noted that she was quiet and didn't seem in distress. From the pawn shop, she headed south. Around 9 a.m., she entered a Tim Hortons restaurant and sat there while on her phone. She was likely there to use the Wi-Fi. She sat there for 13 minutes, continually glancing at the entrance behind her. She leaves the restaurant and surveillance captures her walking around the various stores, walking through parking lots. And at one point, she had her phone to her ear and is talking into the phone. Phone records showed no evidence of a call being made at the time. So it was likely she was using a third-party app like the FaceTime call feature, as she had no cell phone records matching a call at that time. When I was a teenager, I relied heavily on apps like Facebook, Skype, WhatsApp to communicate, as I rarely had enough minutes on my phone to make calls. I remember frequently going to places like Tim Hortons or Starbucks just to use our Wi-Fi to message friends. She re-entered the same Tim Hortons restaurant at 9:55 a.m. She messaged a friend, "Hey, I need your help." But 20 minutes later, right before she left the restaurant, she messaged back saying, "Never mind, I figured it out." The friend didn't get either message until later that evening because she'd left her phone at home accidentally. While in the restaurant, Michaela asked a stranger to help her book a hotel room. The woman refused, not really giving Michaela much thought. Michaela had previously mentioned to friends that she wanted to go on a vacation to Regina, Saskatchewan. Other friends her mentioned Moose Jaw, Prince Albert, or Saskatoon, all larger cities nearest to the small community she lived in. Her friends said that Michaela would often talk about leaving town to get away to a big city, but they didn't pay much attention to her most recent ideas as they assumed she was just dreaming. Michaela's friends said that she often made friends online using social media platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, and Facebook. In the days prior to her disappearance, she had mentioned a friend was coming to meet her. All they knew about this person was that his name was Christopher. Michaela goes back to her school around noon, but is only there briefly. 12:03 p.m., she was seen on the school's surveillance system leaving the school, and when she rounds the corner, that was the last time she was captured on CCTV cameras. Her cell phone was either turned off, or the battery died at 7 a.m. the next day. Since no cameras saw which direction she was walking in, it is assumed that she was picked up by someone. Michaela's grandmother arrived at the school at the end of the day to take Michaela to a violin lesson. And when she didn't come out of the school, Michaela's mother was called. Her mom immediately checked the slush fund she always kept in the house for emergencies. Michaela knew about this, and it was like a jar of money that was kept in the house. Her mom said it was completely untouched. Michaela also didn't take many belongings with her. Nothing really noticeable was taken, and the backpack she is seen carrying could only fit clothing for a couple days. In the months following her disappearance, some of the people she communicated with online were tracked down, but none of them were in the area at the time of her disappearance. Her mother, Paula Bali, remains hopeful that Michaela will one day be found. She doesn't believe her daughter had meant to leave for an extended amount of time and thinks she may have fallen victim to a human trafficking operation. If you have any information about Michaela Bali, please contact the Canadian RCMP. The family is offering a $25,000 reward for her safe return. September 14th, 2007 seemed like any other day. The Gosden family was going through their usual morning routine in their Doncaster, South Yorkshire home. Glenys Gosden noted that her son, Andrew, had a difficult time waking up and seemed irritable. It wasn't initially thought of as anything more than typical teenager issues, but it was unusual for Andrew, as he was usually an early riser. The family consisted of Glenys and Kevin, who were the parents of 14-year-old Andrew and 16-year-old Charlotte. Andrew left the house at his usual time at 8:0:5 in his school uniform and headed in the direction of his bus stop. Andrew was only 8 days into the school year, and his parents were surprised to learn that in the days following his disappearance, he had stopped taking the school bus and was walking the 6.4 kilometers home instead. Andrew was small for his age. Although he was 14, he looked much younger than he was. He wore a strong prescription of glasses. He was deaf in one ear and was described as quiet and shy. Andrew also had a unique double ridge on the inside of his right ear. Andrew was highly intelligent. He was in the Young Gifted and Talented program designed for the top 5% of students. Andrew didn't seem to really enjoy school. He felt it didn't challenge him. In the summer of 2006, he had attended a 2-week program at Lancaster University, and his parents noted that he was very excited to attend the program. He had a small group of friends at school, but his parents said that he didn't socialize outside of class. He would spend most of his time in his room listening to music, reading, and playing video games. His parents said they didn't notice any signs of depression or bullying, but Andrew spoke very little about school. That morning, although he headed in the direction of his bus stop, he didn't get on in. He went to a cash machine and withdrew £200 from his bank account and waited in the park until his parents and sister left the house to go to work. Andrew returned home and changed out of his school uniform. It was found later in the washing machine. He put on a black Slipknot t-shirt, black jeans, and packs his favorite book bag. He took with him his wallet, house keys, and a PSP, a portable PlayStation device. It was noted that he didn't take the £100 in cash that he had had from his birthday in his room. The charge refers PSP, his passport, or coat. By 8:30 a.m., Andrew left home. He was captured on a neighbor's CCTV footage headed down Littlemore Lane, back towards the park. He walked to the train station and bought a one-way ticket to London. The ticket seller remembered Andrew and noted that she had tried to sell him a round ticket, but he insisted on one way. It would only have been an extra £1 to get the round-trip ticket. Andrew boarded the train at 9:35 a.m. A woman who sat next to him on the train said she remembers him as being quiet and fully engrossed in playing a game on his PSP. Andrew arrived in London at 11:20 a.m., and CCTV captures footage of him leaving the King's Cross train station at 11:25. This was the last confirmed sighting of Andrew. The Gosden family didn't notice Andrew was missing at first. The school had attempted to notify his parents, but they called the wrong number to inform his parents that Andrew hadn't been at school that day. The Gosden family sat down for supper and assumed Andrew was in his room playing video games. When they finally noticed he wasn't there, his mother started calling his friends to locate him, and this was when she found out he hadn't been to school that day. It was around 7 p.m. when the police were called to report Andrew missing. They initially thought he had suffered an accident or worse, was abducted. As his parents didn't believe he would have any reason to run away, an extensive search was undertaken of the area, and it took police 3 days to learn Andrew took a train to London, putting their searches in the wrong area. It was the person who had sold him the ticket that had called the tip line, and it took police 3 more weeks to find the CCTV footage of him leaving the train station. Andrew didn't have social media, and it was unlikely he went to London to meet someone. The only computer in the house that could connect to Wi-Fi was his sister's laptop, which Andrew didn't have access to. The computers at Andrew's school and the computers at the local library were also checked, but nothing related to Andrew was found. His PSP and his other video game console were also checked, and it doesn't appear that he had ever used the device features that he would have needed to talk to people. His sister said that Andrew had very little interest in connecting with people online. She said he just didn't seem social. The reason why Andrew wanted to go to London may have been to attend a concert. 30 Seconds to Mars was playing the day he disappeared, and there was also a local metal band that was playing a farewell show. The farewell show would be the last of the band's original vocalist, and the band had previously opened for larger bands like Slipknot. Andrew loved metal music, but Andrew's parents were unsure if he was a fan of either band. Both bands appealed to their fans to submit any photos taken from the concert to have police scan them for evidence of Andrew. Andrew's father also said that Andrew's favorite TV program was The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perron, a story where the main character fakes his death and starts a new life. Andrew, however, didn't take enough belongings to take an extended journey. He didn't take clothing, a jacket, his chargers, or the remaining cash he had available. Throughout the years, there have been dozens of tips called in to police, but nothing has led to the discovery of Andrew. In 2008, a year after his disappearance, a man went into the Leominster police station and used the intercom system to report a sighting of Andrew. The intercom system was used to replace staff reception, and by the time an officer arrived, the man had left. The police made a public appeal for the man to come forward. A man later wrote to the BBC claiming to be the man with details of a possible sighting in Shrewsbury. It wasn't confirmed that the man was the same, nor was Andrew found in Shrewsbury. Renewed hopes of finding Andrew came in 2018. The Gosden family revealed that someone had sent them an online conversation with an individual and an unknown person with the username Andy Rue. Andy Rue claimed that their boyfriend left them and that they needed £200 to cover rent. The person offered to send him money, but the user said that they didn't have a bank account as they had left home when they were 14. Rue is a nickname that was given to Andrew as a child. Gostin would be 27 now. He has been missing for over 13 years. His parents are desperate for his return, and should he or anyone who knows him sees this, they ask that he reaches out and lets him know that he's okay. Andrew is loved unconditionally and would be very welcomed home. Another gifted student went missing 10 months after Gostin, 16-year-old Alexander Slowly. There isn't a lot of information on his case. He disappeared from London, UK, failing to return home from a friend's house. Alexander had little money, no extra clothing, or a passport. He did have a cell phone, but it lost connection the day he went missing. Investigators believe the cases may have a link, but they aren't sure what that connection is. Alexander was last reported to have been around the King's Cross station, the same area where Andrew disappeared. On May 14, 2008, in Marshall, Minnesota, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was leaving his college following the end of the spring semester. It was just after midnight when he left the Minnesota West Community and Technical College campus. At 2 a.m., he called his parents on his cell phone, and he told them he'd crashed his car into a ditch and couldn't get it out. He said he was uninjured and was able to get out and was standing on the side of the road. He asked his parents if could get picked up, and he told them he was located near Lloyd. He opted not to walk along the highway and instead was walking along a gravel dirt road. His parents set out, however. They were unable to find him or the vehicle. Brandon remained on the phone with them as they searched. Brandon said that he would flash his car lights, and his parents did the same on their vehicle, but neither saw flashing light. Eventually, Brandon decides to leave his car and starts walking towards what he thinks is Lind. He told his dad to meet him at the parking lot of a local bar. His parents were driving to the bar that Brandon marked to go, hoping they would find Brandon walking along the road on the way. 47 minutes into the call, Brandon's parents heard him yell, "Oh shit," and after that the call was disconnected. His parents called his phone over and over, and it continued to ring until the following day. Presumably, the battery died. Brandon's phone was never found. His parents continued searching, but were unable to find him. At 6 in the morning, they called police to report him missing, but police told him they needed to wait to see if he would turn up. Because Brandon was 19, there wasn't any sense of urgency. They did pull his cell phone records, and the last location ping put him near Porter, 25 miles from where Brandon said he was. Following this, his car was located ditched near Taunton. From where Brandon said he was and from where his vehicle was found, it was in a completely opposite direction. It is unclear how he seemed to mix these two locations up. At the parties he attended that night, friends said that he was having alcoholic beverages, but they felt he hadn't drank that much and he wasn't visibly intoxicated. His parents also stated that he didn't sound intoxicated or confused on the phone. His vehicle had no damage. It was just tipped at an angle that would require a tow to get him out. The grass and gravel along the road inhibited the police's ability to determine what direction the vehicle had come from. Police and volunteers searched for Brandon by ground, horseback, and by air. All-terrain vehicles were used to search the surrounding area, and sniffer dogs were deployed. Brandon had told his parents that when he was walking, he could see fences and he could hear rushing water nearby. He was walking along the Yellow Medicine River. The prevailing theory is that Brandon slipped and fell into the river. However, extensive searches never revealed a body. Another theory is that Brandon fell into the water, but was able to get out and walk, and then succumbed to hypothermia. Brandon's parents continued to leave their porch light on for him, hopeful that one day he will come home. In 2009, they spearheaded legislation that was signed into law. Brandon's law now requires police to make a report whenever a person of any age is reported missing, and an investigation must start immediately. Avanel Cowgill, a 79-year-old Texas native, had spent most of her life in East Dallas. She had resided on Ellwood Drive for 50 years and had been living alone since her husband Jim passed away in 2009. Avanel had 2 daughters, Patty and Janet, who lived out of town, and she was also a devoted great-grandmother. She kept herself active through volunteering, donating to charity, and assisting at her church, which was a great passion of hers. Her fellow church members described her as exceptionally kind, someone who would give you the shirt off her back and did everything possible to help anyone in need. The church had become a second family for her, and the bond they all shared was very close. She was a fantastic cook and became well known for her baking, specifically her cookies, and she would often bring them in big batches for everyone to enjoy. She spent March 7th volunteering at her church, nothing out of the ordinary, mainly answering the phone in the office, as well as putting together some flyers. She left at 3:30 p.m. and made a stop at a local store before heading home. Her daughter said her usual evening routine was relaxing in front of the TV and working on her crochet. Charity was never far from her mind, and she would often spend her evenings making hats that she would donate to the homeless. March 9th was a cold and rainy day. Janet hadn't heard from her mother at all and phoned her to remind her to put the clocks forward an hour that night. Avanel and her daughter spoke every day, but this time the usual impromptu response from her never came. Perhaps she had just stayed out later at the church, her daughter thought. Later that night, however, Janet got a call of her sister. Patty was hoping Janet had heard from their mom, as Patty hadn't heard anything for 2 days. A feeling of panic set in straight away, and they called authorities and requested a welfare check. Officers arrived at Avanel's home at around 11 p.m. They knocked on the door several times, but they too were met with silence. A stack of newspapers was sat on the front porch, and after a walk around the building, they noticed the back door was wide open. The lights and television were still on, and her knitting materials were next to her armchair. The officers turned off the television and called out her name. As they walked into the kitchen and dining area, they found her face down in a pool of blood on the floor. She had been beaten and had severe blunt force trauma. It was clear that she had been dead for a few days. Her purse, ID, along with some of her jewelry and coin collection were missing. Her kitchen bin had been emptied, and there was a wooden stool near her body which had blood on it. There were no signs of a forced entry indicating she could have known the person or people and let them in without any concern. And after the attack happened, they ran out the back door. But being 79 years old, 5'3" and very petite, it was also entirely possible that she had opened the door before being completely overpowered. Homicide Detective Scott Sayers was handed the case and arrived there just after midnight. Janet was still holding out hope and ringing her mother's phone, praying she would suddenly pick up and have some simple explanation. Detective Sayers answered the phone and broke the awful news. 2 rewards totaling $15,000 were offered up, and police started going door to door. Her family could think of no one who would have wanted to hurt her. She held no grudges and was well loved and respected in her community. None of her neighbors recalled seeing or hearing anything. This then made the police think that whoever her killer was most likely got in via the back door. Fortunately, her house phone had several voicemails from her bank. The fraud department had called her a day after police believed she had been killed. Attempts had been made on her credit cards that had flagged up straight away. An attempt to withdraw money had been made at an ATM at 11 p.m., the day she was last seen alive. The footage from the ATM was grainy and blurred, but it confirmed it was most definitely not Avanel using her own cards and further supported their thoughts that she had been killed on 7th. A few hours later, just after 2:30 a.m., a successful purchase had been made at a Walmart on Forest Lane, just a 10-minute drive from her home. Fortunately, Walmart was full of cameras and open 247, so officers were quickly able to take a look at the footage. The camera showed what looked like the same man that had been at the ATM, and he can be seen pushing a shopping cart around the aisles. He then heads to the tills and attempts to make a purchase. The card is declined and he walks away. A few minutes later, however, he returns and walks back into the electronics aisle where he picks up an iPad. He swipes one of Avanel's cards, and this time it's successful. After this, he calmly leaves the store. At 5 a.m., Avanel's credit cards had another attempt made on them at a different Walmart around 20 miles away. Although the man had changed his clothes, it was definitely the same person. He walks to the till and attempts to purchase a laptop and an Xbox 360. The card declines several times before he gives up and leaves empty-handed. He puts his hood up before walking through the parking area towards a Whataburger restaurant 5 minutes away. While he was walking over, a silver-colored car was sat outside the restaurant. Another man gets out of the car and goes into the Whataburger. He collects his order and heads back out to the car before driving away. The man from Walmart then enters the restaurant's car park. He paces around for a while before the same silver car pulls up. He gets inside and they drive off. Although the license plate of the car could not be made out, the men weren't being discreet and were leaving a clear digital footprint for the police to follow. Sayers and his team were closing in, and they announced to the media it wouldn't be long before these men were caught. They just needed that little bit more. On March 15th, Avanel was laid to rest. Her daughter said it was standing room only because so many people wanted to be there and say their goodbyes. Family and friends said although it was a beautiful day remembering her, it was overshadowed by the anger, frustration, and fear people felt. Authorities released the CCTV, and the footage quickly started flooding the media. As the public started trying to help identify the two men, Detective Sayers was focusing on the iPad and sent a search warrant to Apple. They had a serial number and model, and hoped Apple would be able to determine if the iPad had connected to Wi-Fi. From this, they obtained 3 addresses, one of which was a resale store called Entertain Mart. In order to process any sales, the store requests ID. Fortunately for Sayers and his team, Entertain Mart had taken the iPad, and finally, a name could be put to the face. It was 28-year-old Daniel Brooks, a known heroin user who had had run-ins with the law before. Daniel had just been arrested in the city of Richardson, just several miles away from the scene of the crime in Ellwood Drive. He, along with a man named David Heron, had been arrested for attempting to steal an elderly lady's purse. David Heron fit the description of the man ordering the food and driving away with Daniel. David and Daniel had gone to school together. David had graduated from university with a degree in creative writing before going through several stints in treatment centers for his heroin dependency. Daniel soon lost his job as a veterinary assistant and started using heroin too. He would fall deeper into his addiction, later losing his apartment, and began living with David in David's car. The two men were still being held in Richardson, and Sayers and his team headed over to bring them back for questioning. In a parking spot outside, police found the car, and it was evident that the men had been living in it for some time. Detective Sayers was in charge of the interviews and started with David. He said he thought David would be easier to break and get the truth from. During his first interview, David admitted to letting Daniel borrow his car with the intention of robbing someone's house to get money to buy heroin. Daniel thought this was the easiest way to get money, but David was reluctant, having lost his mother when she was strangled during a home invasion. He said he was also worried someone might be at home. It was mid to late afternoon at the time and still very light outside. Daniel decided to go through with it alone and said he would meet David once he had got what he needed. He took David's car and left him at a nearby Walgreens for about an hour. When Daniel returned, David said he noticed items in the car that were not there before. He also recalled that Daniel was no longer wearing the same clothes. Daniel appeared visibly upset and agitated, dry heaving and then throwing up. Although Daniel told him the house he robbed was empty, David said his demeanor wasn't matching up with that, and it was clear something terrible had happened. Detective Sayers then moved on to Daniel. In Daniel's interview, he admitted to using her credit cards, but said he had been given them by a dealer called Justin. He denied killing her and said he hadn't been in her house at any point. After this, he asked for a lawyer, and the interview was terminated. There was no DNA of either of the men found in Avanor's home, or on any of the clothes they'd seized so far, and Detective Sayers was starting to fear they might not get enough to issue a capital murder charge. But a week later, on March 28th, David's second interview got underway, and in the presence of a lawyer, he gave a new and very different story. He said Daniel had admitted to talking his way into Avanor's home by telling her he had lost his dog and needed help. Once inside, Daniel said he had started threatening her before stealing her things. David said he had asked Daniel if anything had gone wrong while he was in the house, but Daniel said all he'd done was scare her. Daniel proceeded to change out of his boots into a pair of white tennis shoes. David remembered seeing something that looked like blood on the boots, but he didn't ask any questions. Police hadn't yet checked these boots, but they happened to be the boots Daniel was wearing when he was booked into custody. They hoped that David was right, and this would definitely put Daniel inside Avanel's home. David said after this, they made the trips to Walmart and slept in the car for a few hours before going to Entertain Mart, where Daniel got $440 for the iPad. They then drove to a pawn shop in Oak Cliff to get some money for Avanel's jewelry, antique coins, her purse, and some silverware. Daniel changed his clothes again before he entered, something which the cameras inside the shop confirmed. He pawned the stolen coins for $40 before they arranged to meet a dealer called Cassie and bought a large amount of heroin. They used the rest of the cash to pay for a motel in Oklahoma City. That night, David wrote in his diary, "No coming back. In the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma, from around the bend, the train is coming while my feet rest securely on the tracks. A sinking ship with no captain. This is ultimate sin." A day later, all the heroin was gone, and they returned to Dallas because they didn't know any drug dealers in Oklahoma City. Every bit of David's story was checking out and was backed up by the CCTV. And fortunately for the investigating officers, the test results were now back from Daniel's boots. They were positive for Avanel's blood. After David's car had been towed and examined, her driver's license was discovered inside. The charge against David was soon dropped due to insufficient evidence, and he was charged with burglary instead. David entered a plea of guilty and was sentenced to 5 years behind bars. Daniel Brooks entered a plea of not guilty and a trial got underway. His defense team argued that Daniel's intention was to rob the house in question, but when he went in, he found her already dead inside. The defense also said that the blood on the boots was a transfer stain and had come from walking around her body and brushing against it, not from attacking her. His lawyer laid the blame firmly on David, saying he was the creator, the writer, the director, and the main actor in this travesty. Unfortunately for the police, prosecution, and family, too many jury members had doubts. On June 11, 2014, after a 5-day trial, the jury was in a deadlock, resulting in a mistrial. Prosecutors would not take this lying down, however, and found an expert specialized in blood spatter analysis. His experience and knowledge confirmed that the blood was not a transfer stain. The blood was in motion at the time it hit his boot, pointing to him being her killer. Daniel was reindicted and again entered a plea of not guilty. This time, thanks to the hard work of the prosecutors and their new blood splatter evidence, he was found guilty of capital murder. In Texas, capital murder is punished with either a life sentence without parole or the death penalty. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Daniel's legal team filed a motion for a new trial, which was overruled. In 2017, they then filed a challenge to the overruling, saying there were issues with the evidence and how it had been presented in court. The true crime TV show The First 48 covers the case as it was happening as part of an episode. Daniel's lawyer argued that the episode didn't present anything fairly, and this could have impacted the trial if anyone had watched it. But this was also overruled and the judgment was affirmed. After Avanel's passing, Janet said her last box of cookies was still in the church. No one wanted to eat the last one. Janet said she talks to her mother all the time, telling her about her day and asking for her advice. "I sometimes just need her to be there, to talk me through it all and give me a hug," she said. Avanel Cowgill's pastor said she will always be remembered as someone that cared deeply for others and would have done anything for anyone. Helen was the third of 6 children born to Theo and Helen Carapus. The large family lived in Marrickville, a suburb just outside of Sydney, Australia. In the months leading up to Helen's disappearance, Theo and Helen had separated, with Helen being awarded full custody of the children. On December 22, 1988, the children were playing at a nearby playground. 10-year-old Helen spent most of the afternoon playing with a large group of neighborhood kids and her siblings. Beulah called her children in for supper around 5:30 p.m. Their home was close enough to the playground that the children could easily hear their mother calling them to come in. 5 of the 6 children returned, but there wasn't an immediate cause for concern. It was initially assumed that Helen had gone for supper at a neighbor's house and forgot to tell anyone. Although, when the sun went down and Helen hadn't returned, the family began searching for her. They began knocking on all of their neighbors' doors, and when they discovered Helen hadn't gone over to a friend's house, the police were called. Her siblings were confident that Helen had been with them as late as 5 p.m. No one remembered seeing anyone suspicious or out of the ordinary in the area, and it just seemed as if Helen had walked away from the group. The initial suspect was her father, Theo. At the time of his daughter's disappearance, Theo had been abusing alcohol and was known to be violent. It was also theorized that Helen had run away because of her father's abuse, but the family feels that this is unlikely as it was very unlike Helen to run away. She was very close to her older sister, Maria, and it didn't seem likely that she would run away without her. Investigators eventually concluded that Helen had been abducted, though there was no evidence to go on. There is still a $50,000 reward for any information on Helen. She would be 42 today. In Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, 4-year-old Michael Dunahee was at a park with his parents. His mom was playing touch football with a local league, and his dad was spectating. Michael asked his mother, Crystal, if he could go to the playground. She said he could, but he was to wait for his dad to come. She remembered watching him walk through the crowd for a few minutes. Michael was wearing a blue hooded jacket, a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle t-shirt, rugby pants, and blue sneakers. His father went to meet Michael at the playground, but he couldn't find the 4-year-old. Michael's dad swiftly alerted those at the park, and a massive search began within minutes of Michael's disappearance. Around 50 people were in the neighborhood calling his name and knocking on doors. Police were also quickly alerted, and it was concluded that Michael hadn't simply wandered off. His disappearance sparked one of the most extensive police investigations in Canadian history. Over 11,000 tips had been received, and police had eyewitnesses say they saw an older man in his 40s or 50s near the park with a van. But the officers were never able to track down that man or the vehicle. The abductor would have only had about 5 minutes to snatch Michael and drive away. Michael would be 34 today, and there's still a $100,000 reward for any information on Michael. His family is still hopeful that someone will recognize him from his age progression photos. In Sturgis, Michigan, 6-year-old Britney Beers was playing outside. At 7:30 p.m., she was riding her bike, and at 8:30 p.m., her mother left to run errands. Britney's half-brother was supposed to be watching her, and he said he saw her sitting on a park bench about 5 minutes after their mother left. A witness who lived in the area told investigators he saw Britney talking to an unidentified man in a red or brown mid-size vehicle. Britney then walked over to this witness and told him that she had made a new friend. She continued to play outside, and the witness left the area. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Britney. Britney's mother returned at around 9 p.m. and asked her son where Britney was. They began searching, and shortly after 9, the authorities were called. Police located Britney's bike that had been dumped near the area she had last been seen in. Sketches of the man Britney had been talking to were also distributed. He was described man and described him as a person of interest that they wished to question. Britney was said by neighbors to be frequently neglected, and people assumed she was often abused. Britney was last seen wearing a white tank top with floral design, pink tie-dyed shorts, and white sneakers. She was missing 4 upper baby teeth at the time of her disappearance. A year following Britney's disappearance, an older brother and younger sister were removed from their home following abuse and neglect allegations. Her father, Raymond Beers, Uncle James Beers, and the father of one of her half-brothers, Kevin Folsom, were all accused of abusing the children, including Britney. Folsom was arrested and charged for sexually abusing a minor, but was released in 2008. In 2000, her case had sparked media attention again when a man was arrested for child pornography possession, and in some of the photos there was a girl who resembled Britney. It was later determined to be a girl from Texas who testified against her abusive parents and had them jailed. A woman who was a neighbor of Britney said that she'd hoped that someone had discovered the abuse Britney was experiencing and took her to give her a better life. Britney would be 29 today. In Pine City, Minnesota, Aaron Mitchell Anderson was a year old when he played in the backyard of his family's home. His mother had left him alone for a few moments, and when she came out, Aaron had vanished. The property bordered the Snake River and was next to a large embankment that led to the river. The police had assumed he had fallen in and drowned even though his body was never recovered, and the police dogs couldn't catch a scent anywhere near the river. The police themselves admitted to only exploring the drowning theory and ignored up to 20 other leads in the disappearance. An extensive search of the area was done several days after his disappearance, but Aaron was only a year old and couldn't have gotten far. Both of his parents firmly believe he was abducted. Aaron has a white birthmark on his lower abdomen and had an enlarged head as a child. He was last seen in a yellow and red sweatshirt with a puffy dinosaur on the front, light gray corduroy pants, a gray ski jacket, a white knit hat with green snowflakes and green ear flaps, brown plastic boots with nylon tops and liners, and gray socks. Aaron would be 33 years old today. Tullahoma, Tennessee, located just over an hour south of Nashville, is described by its residents as quaint and quiet. The community is close-knit, with most people knowing each other. In 2012, 24-year-old Erica Megan Sharpton, known as Megan, lived there. She was part of a large family that had moved around before eventually settling in Tullahoma. She was a hard worker, very goal-oriented, and her best friend said she was really funny, outgoing, and always pushed herself in every way. Megan was just 2 months away from graduating and had a promising career in the nursing field ahead of her. She was always busy but thrived in that environment, enjoying her part-time jobs waiting tables at a local steakhouse, as well as another at a nursing home. She was living with her partner of 3 years, Chris, and everyone said she had everything going for her in so many ways. On July 1st, Megan had made plans to go to her mother's house to see her sister, who was visiting from out of town. But soon after making dinner plans, Megan called her mother Kelly and explained that a last-minute job interview had come up and she would have to reschedule. Megan was excited and said she would even be getting an upfront payment straight away if she was lucky enough to get the job. A hardworking person always looking to progress, her family were just as excited. They wished her luck and agreed to catch up with her later. But hours would pass and neither her family, friends, or her partner, Chris, had heard anything about the interview. Megan was completely silent and wasn't answering her phone. Before long, it was past midnight and into the next day, and people were starting to worry. Whether the interview had gone well or not, they were hoping for her to tell them something. July 2nd, 2012, 1:20 a.m. It had been a very hot and dry day, and in the early morning hours, a couple of teenagers driving down a Wolt road happened upon a fire in amidst the trees. It was a very secluded and unfrequented area. The nearest building was a church about half a mile away, and the nearest home was way across the bridge. This wasn't a road you would have any reason to stop on. It was more just a place to pass through. The teens called emergency services thinking a forest fire had broken out, and they were worried it would spread. Authorities got there not long after and quickly started combating the fire, which had spread quite a distance. Perhaps it was a campfire that had been left unattended or a discarded cigarette, the first responders thought. But they didn't have to get very close to realize it was far from that. The fire had been set to try and burn a body, the body of Megan Sharpton. There was no car nearby and no one else was around. Megan had no ID, no keys, no purse, and no phone on her or anywhere near her. She was naked from the waist down, and the location and position of the fire confirmed that she was already dead before she was set on fire. One of the officers commented on how severe the blunt force trauma to her head was, as they could see how dented her skull was. Along with no identification, there had been no people recently reported missing they could look towards for an answer. But her distinctive t-shirt indicated she was a medical student, and she had several tattoos, so police were able to put somewhat of a description out. Word traveled fast, and after seeing a Facebook post about a girl with star tattoos being found, Kelly had called in. Megan had star tattoos on her ankle representing her siblings, as well as one on her neck, and from these alone, Kelly knew straight away it was her daughter. It was brutal, shocking, and the community was left incredibly frightened as a result. Had she been killed on the way home from the interview? Had she even made it to the interview in the first place? Was the interviewer her killer, or was it a totally unrelated attack? Police started with the people closest to her, one of which was her partner, Chris, and her family admitted they did briefly question him too. The couple had been on and off for a while, and her sister had said her first thought was that he had been involved, describing the couple as oil and water, and most definitely having their ups and downs. Chris told investigators the last time he had tried to call her, she didn't answer. When she didn't come back to the apartment that night, he just assumed she had slept at her mother's. A search of the apartment found blood in the bathroom along with some needles, and this was enough to pull both Chris and his roommate Robbie in for more questions. As they were interviewing the pair, Megan's 1995 red Ford Mustang was located. Inside her car was a handwritten note with an address and some directions on it. 850 Shelfa Road. There was no blood found inside her car, and apart from the notes, there was nothing of evidentiary value in there. But the address did not exist, and police determined it was likely used to lure Megan away. Back at the station, Robbie admitted that the drug paraphernalia was his, but said it was something he was battling alone and neither Chris nor Megan knew he used. Robbie did admit to investigators that he and Megan had been having a secret relationship. This made police wonder, had Chris found out and killed her in a fit of rage? But Chris didn't know anything about the pair and was visibly shocked to hear about it. He acknowledged the issues within the couple's relationship, but officers recalled he was incredibly upset, visibly shaking, and devastated to hear about her passing. This, along with a solid alibi from his workplace, ruled him out. Although Robbie couldn't provide an alibi, his phone activity showed he was texting Megan all night and into the early hours, worrying about where she was. Officers were also satisfied that he had played no part in her murder. Chris did give police something to work on, though. A random man had called one of Megan's phones on the day she was last seen. He was looking for someone to be a carer for his grandmother and that Naomi had recommended her. Megan was keen to get more hands-on experience in the field she was looking to go into, and this was the perfect opportunity. This was the mystery job she had been so excited to tell people about, but this was the first time they had heard a name linked to it. The only Naomi Chris knew of was someone who had studied with Megan in the previous year. Police set about following up on this lead, but while they were doing this, something else was brought to their attention. As well as the name Naomi, the high-profile disappearance of 20-year-old Holly Bobo just 6 months prior gave detectives more to consider. Holly Bobo had also been studying nursing and had gone missing in the county of Decatur, around 130 miles away from Tullahoma. Authorities couldn't help but wonder if there was a link between her and Megan, and the community noticed similarities between the pair as well. The media started running with the idea that this could be the work of a serial killer, further fueling the fear amongst everyone. By process of elimination, they managed to get an address for the only Naomi they thought it could have been and headed over to her house. She wasn't home, so officers got hold of her phone number from a neighbor. They were surprised to hear that Naomi didn't recommend her for the job. She didn't even like Megan. She said she barely knew her, and the extent of their relationship was that they had carpooled to their classes together a couple of times. When asked why her name would have been mentioned, she said she had no idea, as she wouldn't have recommended her for anything. Naomi told police she couldn't help any further, and the officers left, confused and frustrated, as this was the lead they were counting on. A short while later, Megan's autopsy results came back. The report revealed that she had been raped before being beaten and shot through her cheek. Although the blunt force trauma was so severe, her skull was almost shattered. It was the bullets that had killed her, and authorities felt strongly that she was likely beaten with the gun. Although the phone Megan took with her that night was never located, Chris was able to find the phone that had received the call about the job. Finally, they had access to the mysterious number. The call had come from an unregistered prepaid phone. 12 weeks after Megan had been found, investigators had something concrete. The number linked with the prepaid phone sent them to a store in Tullahoma, where the phone was purchased. The cameras inside the store gave them a description of the man buying the phone. At one point, he put his own phone on the counter, indicating he was clearly buying another phone that would be harder to trace for a specific reason. The cameras follow the man outside, and he gets into a red pickup truck. The man would soon be identified as Timothy Gifford, known as Timmy, a small-time drug dealer. And police were surprised that his name could be linked to something this big. When they tracked down the truck, his brother Paul was driving it. Paul said all he knew was that Timmy had bought it off a friend and given it to him. Timmy was tracked down. He was forthcoming and told police he had purchased the phone for a friend, coincidentally the same friend that had sold him the red truck. His friend's name was Donnie Frank Jones Jr., a name that was actually known to police. Donnie had a criminal record and would often act as a police informant. But the connection between Donnie and Megan was still unknown. Timmy said that Donnie had recently gone in for surgery and asked him to buy the phone for him as he couldn't. Donnie gave some of his painkillers to Timmy as payment. After this, Donnie texts Timmy, telling him he wanted to trade in his truck for a Mustang and asked if he could help. Timmy said he didn't understand why. Donnie had several young children and his truck was far more practical. Nonetheless, Timmy agreed to help with the truck and passed it on to his brother. Timmy said the carpet, as well as other bits of the interior, had been very recently replaced. Donnie said his wife had told him it would probably sell quicker if the inside was newer. Only then did police finally work out the connection. Donnie Jones was the husband of Naomi Jones, the woman whose name had been used in the phone call to Megan and the woman they had already spoken to weeks before. Police now had the link they needed and went back to the couple's home, this time with the hopes of searching it. Donnie denied knowing Megan, but suddenly changed his story and said he did remember giving her and his wife a lift to classes once or twice. Donnie said he was at home with his children on the night in question. He denied Timmy's claim about the phone and told detectives they could search his house and take a DNA swab. He said he had nothing to hide. They looked around the home for a while, but found nothing of any interest and left with just the DNA sample. While the results were pending, the nursing graduation ceremony Megan should have been a part of took place. Her 18 fellow students celebrated her life and paid tribute. Kelly accepted Megan's diploma on her behalf. The seat was made up where she would have been sat. The Combined DNA Index System, more commonly referred to as CODIS, is the central location for law enforcement to compare the DNA profiles of individuals who have been convicted of a certain class of crime. CODIS software enables states, local, and national law enforcement to compare DNA profiles electronically, thereby linking crimes to each other and identifying suspects by matching DNA profiles together. Through this and the DNA sample, they confirmed a match to the rape test kits performed on Megan. The DNA came back to Donnie. He was pulled in for questioning, but was still adamant they had the wrong person. He said they never dated and never had a sexual relationship. He was then confronted with the DNA evidence. He quickly changed his story. He said that he and Megan had had a consensual sexual affair, but for obvious reasons for keeping it quiet. Although police knew he was lying, they were unable to disprove this and had no choice but to let Donnie go home. Donnie had been accused of rape in the past, and he also had prior felony convictions for aggravated burglary, aggravated assault, and forgery, and was thus prohibited from possessing a firearm. When police caught wind that he owned guns, this allowed them to obtain a search warrant and place him under arrest. They hoped this would give them more time to look into his potential involvement in Megan's murder. For months after Megan was found, the last pieces of evidence were in that would help police tie Donnie to the crime. The coroner had already confirmed the type of bullet that had gone through Megan's cheek. It was a match for the rifle that belonged to Donnie. The GPS evidence also placed Donnie at the crime scenes. The burner phone that was used to contact Megan was moving alongside Donnie's phone at the time, definitively putting the two phones together in Donnie's car. It had pinged off of several locations. The first being where they suspected Megan had been abducted and attacked. The second where they believed she had been murdered. And the third where her body was found. The location she was believed to have been killed in was a farm owned by his family. It was here that they found a partially burned scarf that belonged to Megan. Donnie Frank Jones Jr. was indicted with 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping, 2 counts of aggravated rape, and first-degree murder. His bail was set at $500,000 million and prosecutors began to prepare for a trial. The burner phone showed that several people had actually been called by Donnie, and they were all people that either cared for the elderly or worked in nursing in some respect. He had been phoning random people, essentially hunting for a victim. Donnie then remembered Megan from giving her a lift a year prior. He used his wife's phone to get her number and used Naomi's name to lure her into a false sense of security. He gave her the fake address and directions that led to a desolate area where he was waiting. Phone records confirmed that his wife Naomi was at work on the night of the crime, and police said she had nothing to do with Megan's murder. They also found no connection between Donnie and Holly Bobo, with separate arrests being made in her case later down the line. Although the charges against Donnie were eligible for the death penalty, prosecutors never publicly stated whether or not they planned to seek it. Donnie Jones Jr. entered a plea of not guilty, but as the death penalty was potentially on the table, it was later said he was keen to cut a deal with the authorities instead. The exchange would be a confession for the removal of the death penalty. In February 2013, 37-year-old Donnie Jones Jr. pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Megan Sharpton. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, he soon asked to withdraw this, stating that his attorney had convinced him to say it and his wife had been threatened. Circuit Court Judge Curtis Smith heard and granted a new motion, but the original judgment soon went back into effect, and he is still serving life without parole. Megan's sister Carrie said, "If Megan hadn't lost her life, I feel very confident that Donnie Jones would still be out trying to trick young women. Megan put him behind bars for life. She sacrificed her life to keep everybody else in our community safe." Kelly Sharpton, who had gone through such trauma losing her daughter in an unbearable way, often spoke of how the pain was all-consuming and relentless. Tragically, in November 2013, Kelly would take her own life. Officers working the case expressed the sadness they felt for Megan, stating her last few minutes of life was pure hell and panic and fear. A young woman with so much promise and so many plans, her life so cruelly snatched away. This, along with the devastating death of her mother, Kelly, deeply affected many people. A 7-foot-tall memorial was created to honor Megan and can be located where she was found that early morning. It is made up of 24 stars, one for each year of her life, and a nod to the tattoos that meant so much to her. Her sister said their family will be forever grateful to the community for their support and their dedication to helping them through it all. On April 28, 1997, in Cape Town, South Africa, Celeste Nurse delivered a healthy baby girl by cesarean section and was recuperating in the hospital. The baby was named Zephanie Nurse. As a first-time mother who was also quite young, Celeste had become accustomed to seeing various nurses coming in and out of her hospital room. It was 3 days after she'd given birth when she began to fall asleep. A nurse was in her room with her and was comforting her as she drifted off. She woke to a different nurse rousing her, urgently demanding to know where her baby was. She looked over at the cot beside her, which was empty. A frantic search of the hospital yielded the discovery of baby Zephania's baby nest, the swaddle she'd been in, a handbag, and a discarded pillow. Investigators concluded that the pillow had been used for someone to appear pregnant, as no one would look too closely at a pregnant woman in a maternity ward. During their investigation, they discovered other new moms who had strange and similar encounters with either a nurse or another expecting mother. One woman said that she had spoken to a nurse that matched Celeste's description. They had only had a brief conversation about motherhood, but the new mother thought that the woman was odd. Another said that she woke to a strange nurse she'd never seen before holding her newborn, and when she questioned her about it, the nurse said that the baby had been crying and she was comforting it. It seemed as though a woman had been hanging around the maternity ward for several days prior to Zephanie's abduction, either as a nurse or as a pregnant woman, and was waiting for a perfect opportunity. Celeste's husband wasn't at the hospital with her while she was recovering. It was also midday on a Wednesday, and family wouldn't be visiting until later on in the day. Baby Zephanie was never found. There had been many leads, and on more than one occasion, Celeste would be given hope by police that a child may have been found, but it was never Zephanie. One child had even been a boy, which was infuriating to the Nurse family. Celeste and her husband, Mornay, went on to have 3 more children. Every year on April 28th, they would celebrate Stephanie's birthday by doing press, always trying to keep Stephanie in the public's consciousness. In 2014, the nurse's second daughter Cassidy headed off on her first day of high school. Cassidy immediately got bombarded by other classmates saying that she looked identical to another girl at the school. This girl was 4 years older and in her final year. Cassidy met and instantly made a strong connection with Misha Solomon. Misha would go on to say, "I almost felt like I knew her. It was so scary. I couldn't understand why I was feeling like this. The two grew very close and began spending a lot of time together. Even though there was a fairly large age gap, they seemed to have a lot in common. One day, the girls took a selfie together and showed their parents the strong likeliness the girls shared. Misha's family had been very dismissive about the photo, but Celeste and Mornay Nurse scrutinized the photo carefully. They requested Cassidy to ask Misha a question. When was Misha born? Misha told Cassidy that she'd been born on April 30th, 1997, the day Stephanie had been abducted. Nothing more was really set on the matter for several weeks until Michaela was pulled from class and asked to submit a DNA test. Michaela was told that there had been a newborn abducted in '97 named Zephanie Nurse. A social worker explained to Michaela that there was no record of her birth and there was evidence to suggest that she might be this baby. The DNA results concluded that Misha Solomon was the missing Zephanie Nurse. After Cassidy had told Marnie and Celeste Misha's birthday, Marnie had asked investigators to look into Misha's birth records where they discovered Misha Solomon had none. Misha was removed from the only home she had ever known. The woman she had known as her mother, Lavana Solomon, was arrested. The man she knew as her father, Michael Solomon, was also investigated. Lavana claimed she never stole Zephanie. She said that she had been receiving fertility treatments from a woman named Sylvia, and this woman had given her a baby girl. This woman was never found, and Lavana had never told her husband or any other family member that baby Misha had been adopted. Michael said that 1997, Lavana had been pregnant and had come home with a baby on April 30th. Michael was released and never charged as there was no evidence that he knew Misha had been stolen as a baby. Lavona was charged and sentenced to 10 years in prison for kidnapping and fraudulently claiming to be the mother of a child. It is believed that Lavona had been pregnant, but miscarried at some point during her pregnancy and faked the remainder of her pregnancy until she came home with the baby. Stephanie never connected with her birth family, and she still considers Lavona and Michael to be her parents. She now has 2 children of her own, and she visits in prison as often as she can. She continues to go by Misha, although she doesn't mind if people call her Zephanie. She had grown up only 5 kilometers from her birth family. Had she not met Cassidy and the two hadn't become friends and taken that selfie, she may never have discovered the truth. On May 7, 2004, 36-year-old Thomas Wayne Grammer was attacked in his home. His wife, who was home with him at the time, said that at 3:15 a.m., 2 men and a woman entered their Lakeland, Florida home. She said that her husband argued with the people, then Grammer was shot several times. The suspects fled the apartment and Grammer passed of his injuries. His wife said that she didn't know why the intruders came into their home or who the people were, and the suspects weren't apprehended. In 2005, Florida began to circulate decks of playing cards that contained photos and information of cold case victims. The state circulated 85,000 decks to various prisons, featuring 52 different cold cases from Florida. The idea came from decks of cards featuring foreign fugitives that were circulated to U.S. troops after 2001. It wasn't long after the cards were distributed that police received their first tip. An inmate had recognized Grammer's case and asked to speak to investigators. The inmate gave them a suspect name of an acquaintance who had confessed to him his involvement in the slaying. Following that, 2 men, 29-year-old Jason Seawright and 33-year-old Reggie Williams, were arrested and charged with murder. The investigation revealed that Grammer had drugs in his home and Seawright had intended to rob Grammer. Seawright enlisted Williams and a woman Grammer trusted named Mary and Wimberly to help him. Wimberly knocked on the door, and when Grammer opened it for her, Grammer was ambushed. Seawright hadn't anticipated Grammer resisting. Seawright said that it had been Williams who was the one to fire the weapon, but Williams said it had been Seawright. Both men ended up being charged with first-degree murder and attempted robbery. Wimberly wasn't charged in her involvement. Grammer's father thanked investigators for bringing his son justice. September 2, 1986, 21-year-old Edgar Latchlip boarded a bus from Kitchener, Ontario, Canada to Niagara Falls. Edgar had developmental delays. Although he was in his 20s, he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. He had also suffered from depression. He'd been living in a group home at the time of his disappearance. His home in Kitchener was about 90 minutes away from Niagara Falls. Edgar had boarded the bus without luggage, and it was assumed he had plans to commit suicide as he had many attempts in the past. But despite extensive searches of the area, his body was never located. Since a body was never recovered, police weren't able to rule out foul play. He simply vanished. Once he got off his bus, he wasn't seen again for 3 decades. Police in 2016 were shocked when they received a call from a social worker in St. Catharines, Ontario. The man had been living under an assumed name only 20 kilometers away from where Edgar had disappeared. The man had suffered a head injury in '86 and lost most of his memory. He had started to recover bits and pieces of memories that made him reach out to his social worker and tell him that he thought he might have had a different name before. The social worker Googled the name he gave them, and the social worker was surprised to discover Edgar Lachalip was a missing person. The man was interviewed by police and submitted a DNA test. The results confirmed that Edgar had, in some ways, found himself. Edgar, now in his 50s, had been living a low-profile life in St. Catharines with the new name he had been given since he had lost his memories. He was reunited with his family, including his mother, who was overwhelmed in Kitchener. The family had never given up hope that they may one day find Edgar. His mother did many interviews over the years to keep his cold case file alive. Kitchener police said that they had never had a missing person cold case solved with the missing person being found alive after so many years ever. This is what Niagara Regional Police Constable Philip Gavin said in a statement. "I've been a police officer for 18 years, and this is something I've seen on TV but never been part of. Absolutely, this is quite rare." On August 30th, 1991, 32-year-old Don Sanchez was seen getting into her boyfriend, Bernardo Base's vehicle, and was never seen again. She was reported missing by her family the following October. Sanchez was a sex worker and had been working for a brothel in Nevada. Sanchez and her boyfriend were last seen leaving a motel in Los Altos, California. Her boyfriend was described as controlling, jealous, violent. Sanchez had told friends that she was afraid to be alone with him. A witness came forward in 1992 and he said that he had witnessed the two in a heated argument and reported hearing the sound of a gunshot. Base was arrested and charged, but there wasn't enough evidence for a conviction and he was released. Base's 1979 Pontiac Grand Prix had gone missing at the time of Sanchez's disappearance. Base's sister had initially told investigators she had sold the car on behalf of her brother, but after Base was charged and convicted for another crime, she said that she had been told by her brother to say that and that she had lied because she was scared of her brother. Investigators received a tip that the car may have been chopped and dumped in an abandoned lot in El Viso in San Francisco. The lot was filled with other vehicles and various metal debris, so the police reached out to the engineers from NASA and Carnegie Mellon University for help. They offered to use a robot that could use real-time processing algorithms and platforms for magnetic and ground-penetrating radar sensors hosted on small autonomous aerial and ground vehicles for intelligent, autonomous Earth science missions. That's a mouthful. Basically meaning NASA was going to use a robot to analyze the debris and match it to the type of debris they were looking for, which was the car, and providing officers with a general area to excavate. This was the first time a technology like this was being used to solve a cold case. The robot was able to locate parts of the vehicle which contained enough evidence to convict Bernardo Base for the kidnapping and murder of Don Sanchez. In 1987, 25-year-old Wendy Nell was residing in Tunbridge Wells, Kent. Known for her humor, spontaneity, and generosity, Wendy was not involved in the nightlife scene but had a passion for travel. Independent and hardworking, she managed a local Super Snap store on Camden Road, where she was a friendly boss who made new employees feel comfortable during their training. Wendy had been married previously, but the marriage ended amicably shortly before she started working at Super Snaps in early 1985. By early 1987, she had transferred to the Camden Road location after moving to a bedsit on Guilford Road. On June 21st, Wendy celebrated her niece's 5th birthday, sharing with her family details about a recent trip to Austria. She was preparing for another trip, this time to Paris, with her boyfriend, Ian, with whom she planned to get engaged. Despite her previous marriage ending, Wendy remained optimistic about marriage and her desire to start a family. The evening after the party, she spent time with Ian at his mother's house. Ian dropped her off around 11 p.m. on his motorcycle, as he needed to get up early for work the next day and did not stay the night. At her door, they briefly discussed their trip to Paris and kissed goodnight before Wendy went inside. The following day, one of Wendy's co-workers, Deborah, reported to work at the Super Snaps to find that Wendy had not arrived to open the shop. At 9 a.m., she was able to contact another co-worker who gave her Wendy's address. Deborah drove over to Wendy's flat and rang her doorbell several times, but Wendy did not answer the door. Her co-worker then called Wendy's mother, Pamela, to ask if she knew where Wendy was. Pamela, in turn, called the Maidstone and District Bus Company, where both her husband, Bill, and Wendy's boyfriend, Ian, worked, just before 11 a.m. after she could not reach her daughter by phone. Ian then drove over to Wendy's home. Like Deborah, he did not get an answer when he rang the doorbell, so he began pounding on the door and calling Wendy's name. When he still received no response from inside, he went around the back of the building where there was a window in Wendy's room that could not be properly secured. Ian could see Wendy in her bed through the window. He could also see some blood. As Ian climbed into the room through the window, he yelled out for Wendy to wake up. Wendy was still not moving. Ian could not comprehend what had happened. He stroked her hair, pulled down her blanket, picked up her arm, and tried to pull up her eyelids in an effort to wake her up, his brain still not processing the fact that Wendy was dead. Ian climbed back out the window and ran to a nearby fire station for help before sitting down and sobbing. In a 2012 statement, Ian said, "Not a day goes by when I don't feel guilty about her death. If I'd stayed the night, she would be alive today." The day Wendy's body was found, June 23rd, was her father Bill's birthday. Wendy had been raped, beaten, and strangled. Just 5 months after Wendy was killed, another young woman from Tunbridge Wells was murdered. 20-year-old Caroline Pierce lived less than a mile away from Wendy. She also worked on Camden Road as a manager at a popular restaurant called Buster Brown's. Despite the proximity of their homes and the places where they worked, it is believed that the two women did not know each other. They may have seen each other in passing, however, as they both frequently ate lunch at the same cafe. Caroline spent the evening of November 24, 1987 out with friends. A taxi dropped her off outside of her flat in Grosvenor Park shortly before midnight. Authorities do not believe she ever made it inside. Several of her neighbors reported hearing screams shortly after Caroline was dropped off by the taxi. One neighbor reported hearing a woman shout "no" multiple times, while others just heard shrieks. Several of these witnesses looked out their windows to try to see what was going on, but none of them saw the woman who was the source of the screams. Caroline was reported missing by her family the following day after she failed to report to work. She would not be located for 3 weeks. On December 15th, her body was found in an overgrown drainage ditch running through farmland in Romney Marsh, nearly 40 miles away from her home. She was only spotted because the man who found her had been driving a tractor, which put him up high enough to see her body down in the water-filled ditch. Based on the extent of the decomposition her body had undergone, authorities believed she was killed the night she was abducted. Caroline's body was found curled up in the fetal position, wearing only a pair of black tights. Authorities believed the tights had been put back on her body after she was killed, as her underwear was missing. Caroline's handbag was located nearby, but the rest of the clothing she had been wearing the night she was abducted was never found. Like Wendy, Caroline had been raped, beaten, and strangled. Both Caroline and Wendy's keys were missing and never located. Both women had at least one distinctive keychain on their keyring. Reports of a peeping Tom around both victims' homes had been made in the months leading up to the murders and on the days when each woman was killed. A man had been seen looking into windows of residences near Wendy's the night she was killed and in the weeks previous. One of Wendy's neighbors, who lived 2 floors above her, reported seeing the same man looking into the windows of a building across the road up to 3 times a week for over a month. 8 weeks before her death, Caroline Pierce had locks fitted to her windows because she did not feel safe, and she filed a report about a prowler a month later, just weeks before she was killed. She had reported seeing a peeping Tom around her home to a former boyfriend. Based on the similarities between the two women's appearance, living situation, and causes of death, as well as the reports of prowlers nearby, the two murders were officially linked by the police. The crimes were dubbed the bedsit murders in the press in reference to the one-room style of flat both the victims lived in at the time of their deaths. Investigators did have some forensic evidence they could use at the time. A bloody fingerprint found on a shopping bag in Wendy's bed, and a distinctive shoe print that did not match any shoes owned by Wendy or her loved ones left on one of Wendy's blouses. There was also evidence that they did not have the technology to fully use in the investigation quite yet, DNA. Colin Pitchfork, the first individual convicted of murder based on DNA evidence, was arrested in September of 1987 after Wendy's murder and before Caroline's. However, it was still a novel technology in the legal system, and police in Kent did not have access to a large database of DNA samples to compare the DNA from the crime scene to at the time. While DNA was too new of a tool to be as useful as it is today, investigators did understand its value and preserved swabs and other DNA evidence accordingly. The case was featured twice on the BBC program Crime Watch over the years, with numerous tips called in following each episode. Police collected hundreds of DNA swabs from potential suspects, none of which proved to be a match to the DNA from the crime scene, and traveled to Australia and Canada to follow up on leads. Caroline's parents relocated, and they do not speak about their daughter's death publicly, although they were very supportive of the investigation. Wendy's parents spoke to the media about the pain the loss of their daughter had caused and the strain it put on their relationship. They again spoke about their hope to finally catch the killer at a press conference on the 25th anniversary of the murders in 2012. Bill Nell died in 2017 after a battle with liver cancer, heartbroken over the lack of resolution in his daughter's case. His dying wish was for Wendy's killer to finally be found, even though he would not be alive to see the arrest. Investigators did their best to use the preserved DNA from the cases as advances in technology, as well as the law provided them with more opportunities to do so. DNA would be found on swabs taken during Wendy's post-mortem examination, as well as her bedding and one of her towels. The DNA profile was run through the National Criminal Database in 1999, but no match was found. By 2019, available technology allowed for DNA to be extracted from the degraded semen sample found on Caroline's tights as well, providing authorities with further evidence connecting Caroline and Wendy's murders. However, there was still no match to the profile in the National Criminal Database. This led investigators to attempt to use the database in a slightly different way. The killer they were looking for had never been compelled to submit a DNA sample following an arrest, but perhaps another member of his family had. They instead tried using familial DNA to identify potential relatives of Caroline and Wendy's killer in the database. Out of the 6.5 million DNA profiles in the national database, they were able to identify a few profiles with enough genetic similarity to indicate that they were related to the man responsible for the bedsit murders. These small number of individuals had a large number of relatives, so authorities began narrowing them down based on age and residence in 1987. The most promising profile from the database appeared to be a sibling of the killer, so this family was most closely scrutinized. The individual from the database had a brother named David Fuller, who had been in his early 30s and living in the next major town over from Tunbridge Wells in 1987. His DNA was never entered into the National Criminal Database, but only because his criminal behavior predated it. He first became known to police when he was still in school for stealing bicycles and setting fires, which resulted in property damage. In the 1970s, he committed a string of what the police called creeper burglaries. When police met with 66-year-old Fuller in 2020, he was living in Heathfield, West Sussex, with his third wife and their teenage son. He also had adult children from an earlier marriage. He told police during questioning that he had not been very familiar with Tunbridge Wells back in the 80s, and that he had never been to the Super Snaps or the Buster Brown's restaurant there. Fuller's fingerprints were taken as well as a DNA sample. One of his fingerprints was a match to the fingerprint left at Wendy's crime scene. His DNA was a match to the DNA found at both Wendy and Caroline's crime scenes. Unfortunately for Fuller, police were also very quickly able to determine that he had lied to them during questioning. During a search of his home following his arrest, they found numerous pieces of evidence that tied him to Tunbridge Wells and to the murders. Fuller maintained detailed records of his daily life going back decades. In his home were piles of old computer hard drives, old invoices and daily diaries, over 2,000 obsolete digital storage drives, and more than 31,000 printed photographs. Sorting through these records, police found numerous invoices for work Fuller had done as an electrician in Tunbridge Wells, as well as diary entries showing he regularly ate at Buster Brown's, the restaurant where Caroline Pierce had worked as a manager. He was familiar with the street where Wendy had lived because he had lived on it in the 1970s, early 80s prior to her moving there. There were numerous photos of Fuller on rides with a cycling club back in the late 1980s. When investigators contacted other former members of this club, they reported that one of the group's cycling routes had gone through Romney Marsh, where Caroline's body had been found. Police also found a picture of Fuller sunning his back sometime in 1980s. In the photo, the distinctive thread of his Clark's brand of shoes was visible, and the pattern of the thread was matched to the bloody footprint left on Wendy's blouse. Fuller was arrested at his home on December 3, 2020. In light of the DNA evidence during a pretrial review, he did admit that he was the person who killed both Wendy and Caroline, but he pleaded not guilty to murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He went to trial in the beginning of November 2021. However, on November 4th, the fourth day of his trial at Maidstone Crown Court, the now 67-year-old Fuller changed his plea to guilty. Following Fuller's change of plea, a statement from the Nell family was read outside the courthouse. Although the guilty plea won't change anything deep down as the pain and loss will always be there, it's good to know you will not be in a position to hurt or cause any more pain, not just for our family but for Caroline's family and friends who have been on this same journey with us and all the other families his life has affected. We feel a deep sadness for you all, the statement said in part. Unfortunately, as the Nell family's statement alluded to, the resolution of the two murder cases opened up a much larger investigation of a different, but still horrifying nature. Most of the storage devices and records Fuller had spent the previous decades hoarding were in plain view when police searched his home. However, police also found a container holding 4 hard drives attached to the back of a cabinet. The cabinet had been pushed against a wall inside of a cupboard so that the container and the hard drives were hidden from view. According to prosecutor Duncan Atkinson, when these hard drives were examined, they were found to contain a library of unimaginable sexual depravity. The 4 hard drives contained 5 terabytes of data storage. They contained millions of images and videos taken by Fuller as he raped and sexually abused corpses in hospital morgues. Fuller had worked as a hospital electrician since 1989, starting out at the Kent and Sussex Hospital and working there until it closed in September 2011. He then transferred to the Tunbridge Wells Hospital at Pembrey, where he continued to work until his arrest in December of 2020. As an electrician, he had an all-access swipe card, which allowed him to enter the area of the hospital where autopsies were performed. According to records, he entered the autopsy area thousands of times. The swipe card system was designed to monitor for unusual access to the autopsy area, but the records appear to have never been checked. Fuller would have legitimate reasons for entering the autopsy area, like checking the temperatures of the refrigerators in them, and surveillance footage shows him carrying equipment he would have needed for such tasks around some of the times he is known to have committed his crimes, providing him with a cover story where another staff member to come across him in the autopsy area. Fuller was able to take advantage of the shift's work by different employees within the hospital. 5 staff members in the mortuary normally worked from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. Fuller's regular shift was from 11 a.m. until 7 p.m., giving him a 3-hour window during which he was in the hospital, but the mortuary staff was not. Porters could bring the hospital, but the mortuary staff was not. Porters could bring bodies down at any time of day or night, but the refrigerators in which hospitals stored them could be opened from both ends. The porters would place bodies in the refrigerators using the door from the main receiving area and would then lock the door. Fuller would access the bodies from within the autopsy area, where no staff was usually after 4 p.m. and the doors were not locked. There were CCTV cameras in the main receiving area, but not in the autopsy area itself in an effort to show respect to the deceased individuals who were being autopsied there. Fuller bypassed the receiving area and its cameras by entering the autopsy area through utility areas. Over 100 women and 3 children, ranging in age from 9 to 100, were seen being abused in the images and videos found on the hard drives hidden in Fuller's home. Authorities were able to identify around 80 of them by the identification tags visible in the available images. Kent police have set up Operation Sandpiper in effort to try to identify the remaining victims. Relatives who are concerned their loved ones may be one of these unidentified victims can contact Kent police via the website. The Victim Support Service has provided a £1,500,000 grant to notify and counsel the families of Fuller's victims. According to Detective Superintendent Ivan Beasley, the scale of this offending is unprecedented in the UK. There is nothing we've ever seen like this. The offenses documented in the files on the hard drives occurred between 2008 November of 2020. This leaves a concerning 20-year gap between the murders of Caroline and Wendy and the offenses documented in Fuller's files. During the original investigation into Wendy's murder, it was determined that she had been raped on the point of death or after death, meaning that Fuller may have committed the murders to give him access to bodies rather than to cover up the rapes of living victims. Authorities are investigating the possibility that Fuller was committing offenses against the deceased throughout the years following Caroline and Wendy's murders. One of Fuller's victims was 24-year-old Azra Kamal, who worked as a researcher for Sky News. She was smart, strong, and dedicated to helping others. When one of Azra's friends was thrown out of her home by an abusive boyfriend, Azra's response was to go to the home and throw him out instead. Azra died after falling off of a bridge in July of 2020. She and another passenger had exited the car they were riding in after it caught fire. Azra fell 40 feet through a gap between the two sides of the A21 dual carriageway near Tunbridge in Kent as she was going for help. Azra's body was raped by Fuller 3 times, with the attacks occurring both before and after Azra's mother, Nevris, came to say goodbye to her daughter. So whilst I'm stroking my daughter's hair, sleeping on her hair, a man had crawled all over her skin, and there's me kissing and cuddling and saying my last goodbyes. And that is quite awful. Quite awful. However, it is not Azra's shame. It is not my shame. Like women who are raped around the world, they have a voice. Azra has a voice. I am speaking out for my daughter, Miss Kamal told Sky News. Miss Kamal has been a vocal advocate for her daughter, calling for increased security measures and the resignation of the chief executive of the NHS Trust in light of the offenses that occurred under his watch. She has also raised concerns over the length of under his watch. She has also raised concerns over the length of sentences offenses like those Fuller committed against her daughter receive under current law. During questioning following his arrest for Wendy and Caroline's murders and the discovery of the hard drives, Fuller admitted to the necrophilia. He also acknowledged that he had researched some of his victims online using sites like Facebook after he assaulted them. He learned the names of these victims from their identification tags and mortuary logbooks. He logged their names and information in a notebook as well as organized the images and videos of their assaults into files, sometimes by name, on his computer. In court, Fuller pled guilty to 32 individual counts of sexual penetration of a corpse, as well as a further group charge of sexual penetration of a corpse that represents 27 other victims. He further pled guilty to Section 63 of the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act of 2008, extreme pornography involving a dead body. While Fuller has not yet been sentenced, between the 2 murder charges and numerous necrophilia-related charges, he will certainly receive a lengthy sentence. However, Nevris, Kamal, and others have raised concerns over the sentencing guidelines for sexually abusing corpses. The maximum penalty for penetration of a dead body is 2 years imprisonment, while extreme pornography involving a dead body carries a sentence of 3 years. Ms. Kamal has called for a much clearer law prohibiting necrophilia and an increase in the amount of time in prison the law requires as punishment for it. Shortly after Fuller's guilty pleas, the Health Secretary announced an independent inquiry looking into his offenses and their national implications. It hopes to uncover how such offenses were committed without being noticed by the NHS for so long in areas where future action will be needed. The report will be divided into 2 parts, with an interim report expected in early 2022 and the full report later in the year. Nevris Kamal will continue advocating for her daughter and working to ensure that an offender as prolific as Fuller will never again be allowed to operate without notice. I've tried to protect Azra all my life, and when she was really helpless, lying there, still being raped and abused, she couldn't scream out, couldn't call me. She couldn't call the police, but I will ensure her voice is heard, and that will be my mission, she told Sky News. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.